much, Laura, for that
You're welcome.
welcome. And I'm really happy to see so many of you here this afternoon. I think as I've looked across the 6 topics that we're exploring as part of the series, this one might be my favorite. I think that the crisis is really causing us to think differently about our work. And so really leaning into concepts like disruption and innovation is really appropriate. And I think that as the weeks pass, our ability as leaders to lean into this topic in particular, I think becomes more possible. So again, welcome. Happy to see so many of you plugged in. And I really do hope, I'll echo Laura's comments in saying that I really do hope this series has been helpful to you. And we're looking forward. We're just about the midpoint. We did 3 sessions. We've got a few more sessions, but really hoping this is helpful to you. For those of you that this might be your first interaction with our firm, FIO Partners, we are a consulting firm that's based here in Connecticut. And our real purpose is to help leaders make better decisions. Our services really do include strategic planning, strategic alliances, certainly training and leadership support. And it's just a pleasure to be working with each of you as you really work to navigate the crisis. Again, so where are we in this series? This is about providing supports, and it's the balance of a peer-to-peer community as well as content to really inspire you and support you as you navigate these times. So we've talked about decision making. We really leaned into retrenchment. On Tuesday, we did a deep dive into scenario planning. And as I said before, today is about disruption and innovation. Next week, we begin to really lean into our relationships for both looking at how do we ensure shared board and CEO leadership on Tuesday, and creating strategic alliances, which is really thinking about the relationships that we hold in our ecosystem and how in some ways partnership may be part of our strategy as we move forward away from the crisis. So in terms of introductions, thanks to Laura, I am Ann Urashek, principal of FIO, and I'm very happy to have Sarah Hall, a consultant from our team, joining me in today's discussion about innovation and disruption. I would love to hear from you, so if you are here with us and would like to introduce yourself, jump into the chat box and share your name, organization, and location, just to give everybody a feel of who's on the line. We are a small group today. We're just about, looks like 20 of us, 18, 20 of us together. So feel free to jump in and really use that chat box to share with the group who you are. And if you'd even like to tell us a little bit about what your organization actually does. Sometimes when we just do the names of our organization, it may actually not help us know what you do. So feel free to be a little more illustrious in today's intro and share with us the work of your organization. And so we'll let that sort of move forward in terms of intros in the chat. And so in terms of what we're going to do today, this is really about, again, practical strategies and choices that you can make as a leader. I said so many times in these webinars that this is about content, but it's also really about tips and guidance around a specific area. So today is about how do we really learn from the crisis? What are we taking away from it? And really, how do we use what we're learning to develop new strategies, approaches to either our programs and our internal systems? And so this is really recognizing that the crisis has created an enormous amount of change and disruption, and we are changing and in some ways pivoting and learning at the same time. And so we want to really talk about today, how do we learn from the crisis to really think about a future and how we are going in some ways to operate with the future that is yet to come. And really thank you to all of you that are jumping into the chat. I think what's been incredible for me is to see the range of organizations that are participating in these sessions and the incredible work that each of you has done and is doing as today and into the future. So what's our agenda for today? We're going to lean into learning from the crisis. We're going to explore what is a new idea. And lastly, we're going to talk about strategies for creating and implementing new ideas. And so with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Sarah to take us through our first section.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. So learning from the crisis, what can we and how do we learn from this crisis? We want to start by talking about the power of disruption. Someone said to me the other day, reminded me of that old adage, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think in some ways we've really been and are going to continue to kind of unpack the meaning of that. So, the status of the sector, we really have seen nonprofit and other sectors be completely disrupted. When we think about disruption, it really pertains to a market for a service or product. Disruption is a process, not an event. It's a relative phenomenon to what was, and really has the potential to transform an industry. Disruption occurs when the context for consumption is radically changed. So, we want to ask you to jump into the chat and tell us what you see as the most disrupted aspects of your organization. What have you noticed? What are the things that are just the most shifted for you in your daily work, for your service population? What are you seeing?
And I'll echo what Sarah shared, that the amount of disruption in the sector is profound. I love Barbara's comment here, constant need to pivot. Yes, I think we've learned a whole new language of change as it relates to the disruption. What are other ways that some of you are seeing the disruption unfold? Everything being remote. More work that needs to happen to mentor, coach, and fill the gaps with people in supervisory roles. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We had a great discussion last week with a supervisor who just talked about the inability to kind of just keep up with people because so much of things happened in person in between meetings, and how disrupted that has been.
Right.
Communication between volunteers, doing DV services remotely, reliable sources of income, faculty as the glue that holds the community together. Thank you for that, Anne.
And if you missed an interesting comment on missing the creative spark of staff being in proximity to each other.
The water cooler moments.
We've been talking a lot about how do you, we maybe can explore this when we get to the Q&A today. It's what does a virtual water cooler look like for your virtual team? Because it's such a deep loss for so many people. I think we've got to think about some strategies for how do we actually bring that back. So the inability to offer training or rehearse as a full group.
Interesting from Kim Holly that the disruption has empowered staff and that in education, which we've heard from others, has no choice but to keep moving. So great really, input.
Yeah, in terms of immediate relief, an overload, hard to tell what's important. And I think the other thing we've talked about so much about it's disruption in our organizations, but also disruption of patterns in our lives. That I think this crisis, it would be one thing if this was a hurricane and a group or a geography was impacted. It's all of us, and it's not just our work; it's our personal lives as well. Kim says it doesn't mean anyone likes it. Thank you for that. Mindful messages around the workplace, being mindful. Yep. I think all of us would agree that the amount of disruption is unfathomable in some arenas and for some industries. Just the amount of change and the amount of what can't happen right now is really, really, really powerful. And so I think we have to recognize that this disruption has broken systems that in some ways some of us would have agreed that were working, right? Things that worked, things that were impactful, ways of working that were impactful, and that we've lost some of those in this right now. I think that's important to recognize. Sorry, do we want to shift from here into learning?
Sure. So what do we do with this disruption? How do we make sure that we're not wasting the crisis, as my colleague said to me a couple of weeks ago? One important step is making sure that we are taking the time to reflect and to document so that we can learn from our experiences. What are we doing differently? What about what we're doing is working well? What isn't? And do we know why? So, taking the time to really reflect and learn from our experiences during this crisis is crucial to infuse and inform the development of new ideas. There's also a really incredible opportunity right now to kind of lean into understanding what the perspectives and needs are of the people we care most about, our service population, our communities, and lean into this idea of co-creation with our communities and the people we serve, really kind of asking them to come to the table to be our thought partners. Um, Outside voices, I think, are so critical to open our peripheral vision to what's not immediately in front of us. And having diversity in perspectives during these conversations can really only enhance our understanding of what's happening and our learning of what we're going through. So we have a handout that we're going to upload into the chat. And we just wanted to take a minute to kind of walk through it, show it to you, and Anne is going to give us some guidance about how we can use it with our teams.
Thanks, Sarah. And again, I think we've really realized that this journey of learning and reflection, we're going to talk a lot about, and we've done this a bit in our time together, about the importance of reflection, the importance of intentional time as a team. And so what the tool does, or just this handout does, is just gives you some prompting questions to really engage your team around. I think there is this recognition among so many of us that things are changing. We are learning, and in some ways we're learning more about ourselves and our teams and what is most important to those that, as Sarah pointed out, that we care about. And so what I wanted to do is kind of quickly show you this handout, just so that you can see that we also recognize that the questions that we ask today may be a little different than the questions that you might ask a month from now or even 5 or 6 months from now. So this is a tool that was actually developed by a colleague firm, FSG, which is really thinking through what are some of the questions we can ask ourselves in the short term, a little farther out, and then a little farther out than that. And the questions that I think are most important in the very short term are, what are the principles and values that are guiding us right now? What's going well? What do we need to change and how we're responding now? How are we staying true to our commitment to equity? How is this showing up in our work? What options are available to us and some of the consequences of those options? What assumptions might we be making? What's unique about our situation? And then I also gave you some additional questions that are really, again, pushing this conversation about what's changed already. So what are we learning about what matters most for those we serve and for our internal team? What changes or adjustments have we already made to programs and services? What's already in the process of being changed? And which of these changes should potentially continue into the future? We've talked to so many clients that are like, we changed that thing that was like really hard to change in about a day and a half, and it's actually working better than it ever did. So again, what are some changes that we should be keeping? Is there non-essential work that basically we should not pick back up again? What's working best in terms of communications? What are some workarounds maybe that we've developed? And again, the existential question of how many meetings do we need to have and which ones are essential and which ones are not. We really hope that this in some ways helps you guide some of these opportunities to reflect and learn as a group and really document what you're learning from the crisis. I know in some of our discussions with some of you, you are already changing and learning, and there's real power in that, and there's real opportunity to kind of capture that and carry that as you go forward. So I'm going to bring us back to the slides now. Sarah, anything else to add on that piece around the reflection?
No, I think you got it. I think you covered it all. And I don't know too, and how helpful would it be to have sort of different types of groups around the table when asking those questions, right? Like that can be a sample of board, or it can be some stakeholders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think everyone is learning right now. And so we'll talk, and I don't know, Sarah and I will probably beat the drum throughout this chat, which is really about how can we include as many voices, both in our reflection work and our generation of new ideas work, because we really think that, we don't always know best from the insides of our organizations, and how are we raising up voices and amplifying them in our work is critical as we look ahead.
So we're going to pivot to talk a little bit about what is a new idea, this idea of new ideas. But before we do that, we want to talk about kind of knowing yourself and your position. So we really want to encourage you to recognize who you are in the market, an incumbent or an attacker. So, are you a large organization that has large market share and for whom innovation is going to be very difficult? Or are you a smaller organization that has been nimble in the past, is comfortable being nimble? Um, and if you are a large organization that will have difficulty being nimble, are there areas in which you can create opportunity or space for innovation to live in the organization that are kind of separate from the slow decision making of an incumbent organization? So understanding this and kind of who you are will help to set the context for innovation and decision making. So just quickly, some characteristics of incumbent organizations, generally pre-established as large market leaders, takes these types of organizations much longer to understand the impact of disruptive forces, favor through their structure, incremental change, and generally have managers and staff who were chosen because of their expertise and experience in kind of incremental problem solving rather than adapting to dislocating innovation. Whereas attacker organizations are smaller and more nimble, and for which innovation is likely going to be easier.
And Sarah, I think just as before we move to the next slide, this piece about context and knowing yourself is, I would assume that some of you, even in the last few weeks, have already experienced this. As the disruption became more clear, did you experience resistance from other staff and managers? Did you, experience in some ways a comfort with the ambiguity? So, this speaks a lot to organizational culture. And so as we move into talking more about new ideas, it's about just taking that moment to really reflect. And who are you as you entered into the crisis? And just taking a moment to just sort of reflect and think about how your organization has handled the crisis. And then in some ways be thinking about what may be challenging about what we're about to propose, which is really a process of exploring new ideas. So thanks for that, Sarah. Good.
Thank you. So when life is good and everything is going well, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, right? Don't mess with things that are successful. But when challenges occur, when disruption occurs, organizations need to innovate. So the quickest path to innovation is making new, novel connections, forming new ideas. And then what we're really going to talk about later on is kind of how to foster these connections and how to implement them. So what is a new idea? Well, there aren't any. So new ideas are simply parts of old ideas that have been combined differently. We can think about new ideas as a space of the adjacent possible, sort of a location between what we know to be true and what isn't yet. So this idea of the adjacent possible sort of built out of a collection of existing parts. The adjacent possible is limited to kind of what we know. the composition of which expands and sometimes contracts over time. And some of these parts that we know are conceptual, they're ways of solving problems, or maybe definitions of what constitutes a problem in the first place. And some of them are literally mechanical parts that put together differently create something new. So the adjacent possible is really kind of the border that pushes forward of current experience, and that is invented by recombining raw material of current knowledge and current experience. And so a new idea is really a network, and it's a network of cells that are exploring the adjacent possible of connections that you can make in your mind. So this is not like a single thing, it's more like a swarm. And this network has to be really densely populated. It has to be plastic and flexible. It has to be capable of adopting new configurations. And these connections are the key to wisdom. So what matters in our minds is not just sort of the number of neurons, right? That's not what matters. It's more the myriad connections that we have of those neurons that have formed. So we have a colleague, Melissa, shout out, who's always talking about the Medici effect. And so the thing that they talk about in that book is really about intersectional ideas. So when we can combine concepts between multiple fields. And in order to do this, we have to have this very sort of dense idea network. We have to have many diverse ideas at the table. We need people who can kind of produce a lot of ideas, and also people who bring very different perspectives from our own. And that's the space where innovation happens. So I'm going to turn it back over to Anne, and she's going to talk with us about strategies for creating and launching new ideas.
Thank you, Sarah. And I just want to pause right there as a group. And I think the adjacent possible, comes out of some fantastic work. Both there's two kind of resources that we've used to create the materials today. One is an author named Christensen, which has done a lot of work around innovation, and we've included some of these resources in the handout. And the second one is a book called The Accidental Creative, which really talks about how do creative individuals really push the boundaries of their thinking and create new ideas. And so we just want to draw those to you as resources and let you know where some of those concepts come from in terms of the network of ideas, thinking about the adjacent possible, and this idea that I love this work because an idea isn't just an idea. I love this concept of a swarm. I want you to start to begin to think about, as we move into this next section, that each of you as leaders actually have the pieces, parts, and connections to build new things. You actually have them already. They aren't just going to show up because they actually are already present. And we just haven't in some ways put them together in constellations that in fact are the drivers of innovation. So what do we see as some of the base foundations for the development of new ideas? There's really three sort of things to think about. The first is information, the second is relationships, and the third is collisions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one. And so the first is this fantastic quote. And so this is why, in some ways, new ideas are difficult. So every organization begins as an advance force and ends up as an occupying force. And so when we think about that concept, I want you to think about a startup. Think about that idea of being an attacker. All ideas are good ideas. We're willing to pilot new things. We don't have pre-existing systems. We build them as we need them. We, in some ways, are advancing a cause, a mission, a set of programs or services. There gets to be a point in organizational development where an organization becomes more stable. We start to say the organization needs more structure, it needs more systems, we need to have agreement about how things work. There are policies to be followed, procedures to be written, because we want things to actually be consistent and be the same. And in order to do that, we actually have to have a higher degree of control around what people do. And there's a point at which in an organization, what we do is what we do, because that's what we do and how we do it. And what happens in an organizational culture at a point in its evolution where it's very clear that we do what we do the way that we do it, What happens to the person who shows up and says, you know, I was at this other thing and I saw a thing and I think we should do it this way? A manager's reaction to that is, oh, thank you so much for that new idea, but that's just not how we do it. And so unfortunately, what happens in organizations, to the quote here, is that we start off as an advanced force, but we end up as an occupying force. We end up in some ways in organizations that may not cultivate new ideas, may not cultivate that young person or new staff person that says, well, I think we should try it this way. Most mid-managers' reaction is like, thank you so much for your enthusiasm, but we've been doing this for quite some time and this is how we do it. And we smash that new idea in some ways, sometimes like a bug. And so we have to remember that as we think about leveraging the disruption and leveraging the crisis, because our organizations are going to have very natural reactions to new ideas. And we've got to start to think about, is that in best service to our mission at this moment in time? And so we may, as an organization, have developed some bad habits that we need to begin to break through as part of looking ahead in the crisis. So when do the new ideas happen? How do we cultivate them as leaders? How do we stay cognizant of both our organizations and the brains in our organizations? And how do we help the brains in our organizations begin to think about these new ideas and to leverage the crisis, to learn from what we're learning, and begin to see new opportunities? And the key here is that we need both, and I'll talk more about this in a second, permission. But really, the brain has to have the capacity to make new connections, and there has to be a randomness to it. And when we think about what we've lost in moving from a physical space to a virtual environment, I think one of the biggest things we have to stay cognizant of is we've lost the ability to have random connections with our teams. How many of you could say, like, hey, that new idea that we had, that was birthed in a hallway. That one came out in a parking lot conversation. That one was right after that meeting I went to, and it wasn't in the meeting. It was 2 days after the meeting while we were having a slice of pizza on a bench that this new thing emerged, right? And so I want us to be thinking about, as leaders, that the first thing we need to do is make sure that our team is still having collisions. And what can random collisions look like in a virtual environment? And we need to push ourselves to say, can we have drop-in sessions? Can we make sure that different departments and different groups of staff are still coming together in unstructured ways to talk about their work? What can we do to ensure that, you know, that people just aren't meeting in their departments and we're doubling down on silos in our virtual organization, but that we're still encouraging mixing and matching people, because that's actually where the randomness and the connections actually happen, and where the kind of birth of new ideas can begin to occur. So what else do we need? And this is exactly what I was talking about in terms of collisions. We need relationships that will actually bump into each other. One of the reasons why innovation tends to emerge out of cities is actually due to population density. It has to do with people literally sometimes physically bumping into each other, in some ways getting to know each other or meeting each other or exchanging an idea or exchanging knowledge or exchanging information. And that happens both in cities and it happens in organizations. And again, this shift to virtual work, I think for all of us, it's been a really palatable loss that we've experienced. And so how do we actually get back to colliding into each other? And I want us to think about, where are we networking as groups? Where are we networking with other nonprofit leaders? I think our series is a way to bump into each other and share information and knowledge. We need to continue to seek out and use information. As I said at the front end of this, you know, Sarah and I have talked a lot about how we think the future of this sector emerges out of the recognition of new problem sets and a redeployment of our assets as nonprofits. But in order to do that, we've really got to be listening deeply and ensuring that that listening is bubbling up as learning and being shared with key stakeholders and decision makers. So we've got to find ways in the chaos that is managing the crisis on a day-to-day basis that we're still seeking out and using good information from those that we care about most. And also, I think from our peers in our industries, there's so much change happening. You know, when was the last time you were able to plug into kind of a national conversation around your part of the sector? There's a number of folks of you that are on in networks. And so I'm thinking about how are you like leaning into your peers around the things that you're trying. This is exactly the time to be seeking information, seeking new ways of thinking, and weaving that into this conversation. And this is probably the most important one, I think, particularly for larger organizations where change and even dealing with the crisis may have been really difficult, is that we've got to authorize the development of new ideas, and then we've also got to protect the process. And I'm going to talk about a process that I think you can undertake. But the first piece of this is the authorization. That you as a leader are really vocally saying, hey, now is the time for us to come up with new ideas. There's some wonderful work out of William Bridges, which is called Managing Transitions, and really talking about change as a process and being in what's called the neutral zone. But this is really the time for leaders to say, I want those new ideas. What are the new ideas that maybe we didn't authorize historically, but you had them? What were they? Those could be really valuable now. So how do we authorize the voices and the participation in both the process to create new ideas? And so what's a process that I think, and Sarah and I talked a little bit about this, that you can take on as an organization? The first is really this authorization and permission of the creation and development of new ideas. Creating a multidisciplinary team as a starting point. Can you bring in outside voices? Can you bring in board members? Are there people in some ways that, we've talked a lot about dealing with the crisis, about having an ad hoc committee to deal with the crisis. Well, that still might not be the right group to, think about the future of your industry, to think about the future of your services and programs. You might need to put together a different team of voices and people to do that thinking with. We want to make sure that you're talking with your clients and your customers. And I use customers really specifically because for some of you, you have clients. You also have people who may purchase your services through earned revenue. So really kind of thinking about what's the lens that you think about for who you serve. I use both of those terms here. The other piece is the conversation about your organizational assets. Sarah talked a lot about the pieces and parts that can make up new ideas. What are your pieces and parts? What do you have to work with? What are your strengths? What are your competencies? What are you known for? What do you think is unique about what you do? And how can that be a part or a piece or a connection in what has yet to be built? And then we want you to really lean in to really explore some key questions. Creating some intentional opportunities. I call it creating containers for conversations about some key questions. And we're going to do a couple samples of those. Start to surface new clusters of concepts that could be new ideas. And then organizations have to commit to piloting things. And I'll kind of think about what do we need to know and what do we need to do in some ways to pilot something new. Sarah, is there anything I missed on the process side of this? I think I kind of hit the high points.
I think you did. Jim jumped in here just to double down on the importance of the authorization process, saying that there are a lot of staff who are either fearful or uncomfortable to raise new ideas or to make mistakes, and that it's important not to assume as leaders that our staff know that this is okay or that we encourage it. So really to be kind of intentional and vocal about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think this is really true in incumbent organizations. At times, it can also be true in attacking organizations, but when we've got a strong organizational culture and we've got strong rules or policies and procedures that are going to be followed, people may not feel 100% comfortable. So how do we, again, kind of authorize that and create safe space for people to really bring all of themselves and their ideas to this conversation about the future? Really important. Thanks for that, Jen. So we wanted to give you some prompting questions as well. So once you kind of build this group, you have this conversation, you're escalating and amplifying the voices of those that you serve. You're starting to think about what's new. I really do think a conversation about organizational assets is the starting point. So it is really about pieces and parts. And I love how Sarah even made the reference earlier that some of those pieces and parts could actually be mechanical things. Some of you might actually have specific technology, specific software, specific access to relationships or networks that are really unique that other people don't have. And so you've got to start with that sort of stock taking of what are the pieces and parts that we could use and actually deploy in a potentially different way. There's a couple other questions that I wanted to also really recommend. One of them is, who's your customer? And is your customer changing due to the crisis? And more importantly, what's the problem that you're actually working to solve? And so I think as we've been engaging clients around some of what they've been facing in the crisis, these two questions are really, really powerful. In some cases, your customer may be changing due to the crisis, or even the problem that your customer used to come to you to solve may actually be changing. And so it's how do we actually engage our stakeholders and exploring these questions, because the reality is there may be a new problem to solve using the pieces and parts that you already have. I'm actually going to lean into, we have some arts organizations on the line, and I think in some ways arts maybe historically, enrichment as something additive to life. And we've been talking a lot about the mental health implications of the crisis, and is there a role for the arts on the other side that's even more substantive than it's been in the past? And so I think there's huge opportunities to lean into, are there new problems that are actually emerging out of the crisis that your organization is actually really well positioned to help address? I'm thinking a little bit about a mentoring organization that we've been chatting with, and that's intergenerational. And what's the role of the future of making sure that older and more vulnerable people increasingly have opportunities to feel less isolated? Is that a problem that's actually going to be with us for a year or a year and a half, where you may have pieces and parts in your organization that can really actually help solve that problem? And so could there be new ways of delivering programs and services that in some ways have mutual benefit that maybe we haven't in some ways explored just yet? And so I give that to you in some ways to kind of keep the thinking and give you some questions to explore once you convene that group. But this is in some ways the cautionary message to remember, is that in any organization, as you become an occupying force, you actually kind of have to protect the idea from the occupying forces. I'm sure each of you has had situations where you've been in early stage idea development, and you've gone to the group and you've been like, hey, I have this really new idea. I think I'm going to try this. And someone goes, oh, but have you thought about that? And have you thought about that? And maybe we shouldn't do that. And that may not. And in some ways, sometimes the new idea sits on the shelf because it may get so much kind of negative blowback or like not supportive messaging that you may just sort of say, you know what, we're not going to do that new idea. But I really want you to encourage to kind of try to keep, it's why there's like, R&D departments that are separate from the rest of organizations. It's because you've actually got to protect that innovation. You've got to protect that idea and let it grow like a little plant. Sarah, did you want to jump in on this too?
Yeah, this is, like we talked about when we were talking about incumbent organizations, it's possible really to have a branch or an arm or a program that is more nimble, that's more innovative, but it really does need to be protected from the decision-making process of the rest of the organization so that it can function the way you intend it to and not get kind of sucked back into the slow-moving barge-like characteristics.
Exactly. And so that's really important, just again, to allow them to grow. And this is probably one of my favorite images of all time. So this actually is a real sign. I'll give extra points to anyone actually who's seen this sign. It is in Connecticut. But the thing about it is that as you try these new ideas, it really might feel like you're going the wrong way. It might feel like it's not working. And I think one of the things that we're certainly seeing from clients as they respond in terms of responding to the crisis and trying new things is we've got to embrace failure. We've got to embrace the fact that it's not going to go well the first time, that it may be bumpy, and that that's okay. It does not mean that the idea does still not have legs. It means you've got to learn. And I love these sort of quotes, being right keeps you in place and being wrong forces you to explore. Being wrong forces you to kind of do something that you were uncomfortable doing. And that's what we need out of this crisis. We need to move from doing it the way we used to always do it to kind of pretty places that are really uncomfortable. And that needs to be okay. We need to talk about what does trying look like, and what does learning look like. And that is where I think the new ideas in some ways really will get legs. And the first time you try a new idea, it may not work, but learn from it and try again. Be willing to try again, and recognize that, especially now, one of the things that I've really recognized in the crisis is everyone's very forgiving right now. It's actually a fantastic time to try new things. We're all doing the best that we can. And if there were ever a time to just boldly do something that you've wanted to try and implement a new idea, it's now. I think there's really this wonderful graciousness in our society right now that says, thank you for trying something new. It may not have been perfect, but it's not about being perfect right now. It is about sort of really living our missions in new and different ways and being willing to try to find the ways to do that. So what we wanted to do, I think in some of our time together, is shift this a little bit. So Sarah, are we ready to give the whiteboard a try?
I think so.
So,
You're sort of in command of it, so.
I am, and I'm going to try to figure out the technology of how to figure this out. So I've got to come over here and over here. Hold on one second.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do was really ask people to let us know the things that you've noticed that are already changing. So what is already changing? What has changed for you? What does kind of innovation look like in your organization?
And so we are actually going to do something which we haven't done with you as a group yet, and we're hoping that you will be game, is we are going to pull up the whiteboard. Have all of you tried the whiteboard yet in Zoom? Everyone's going to be like, yes, and the whiteboard is so old hat. But we're actually going to do something fun. So can all of you see the whiteboard? Yeah, okay, thumbs up. And so what I want you to do is there is a little, you should have a toolbar that says view options. And then there's a little tab that says annotate. And so you should actually get a little set of tools. And what I would love for you to do is grab the text and share on the whiteboard. Just feel free to write down some of the new ideas or emergent thinking that's already happening for you because of the crisis. Where do you think you're innovating and there's new ideas emerging? And then what I'm going to do is actually kind of sort them. So feel free to kind of just jump in, and let's give this a try. This is our first group exercise. I think we can do it.
So if anyone is having trouble finding view options, it's at the very top of your screen, and it should say you're viewing Ann at PO Partners screen, and to the right of that is a drop-down bar that says view options. And as Ann said, you want to go to annotate, and it'll give you a set of tools of which you want to pick text. It seems complicated, but it's like adding something to a PowerPoint, adding a text box.
Good. Giant interactive flip chart. And so each of you should be able to kind of just jump in and write on it with me.
And if anyone, thank you. If anyone's intimidated, you can also put it right in chat, and we will, one of us will put it in there for you.
Great. So we've got, great. Love it, guys. So online arts workshops and classes, training, prevention, and education delivered remotely, using technology more, new ways of teaching our learners, weekly customer calls as a group. Oh, this is so cool. Using videos to celebrate relationships. I love it.
Oh, imagining partnerships that we had shelved before.
Oh, that's great. Adding a virtual component to prevention and community education activities. I love the partnerships. Come back next Thursday.
There's one Ann on top of another on the middle left.
Yep, I'm finding it. There we go. Communicating more regularly on a planned basis. Great. Gratitude. Let people know we appreciate them. Awesome. Thank you all. So, what this tells me as we think about this is that you are already in so many ways using your pieces and parts, using your strengths to build new things, to try new things, to push and nudge and cajole. And in some ways, I love the comment, forcing veteran staff to use 2020 technology. That's huge. This is really about finding the ways and places and spaces to celebrate the new ideas that you're already putting into motion. Staff finding new ways of supporting each other. This is an incredible time of really showing maybe those in our organization that have been resistant to change, that change is possible and new ideas are possible to cultivate in every organization. But we really do need to do it with intentionality and support as leaders.
You
I
got an
think
addition that says board voting, I assume by
Slack. Okay, that is bold. I love it. We can do an entire session on what Slack is and why it's cool. Wow, that's awesome. Great. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to save all your amazing ideas. And I'm going to bring us back to the group. Thank you for that. And thank you all for sharing, in some ways, the new ideas that are already emerging from your work. I think what we wanted to just kind of close out with is really just the message of support and a message of persistence and permission. We really do believe that for each of you that your organizations really are going to be different on the other side of this. And a lot of it is going to be your ability to change quickly, to solicit new ideas and build new things. And so for many of you, you may have not even built the thing that in some ways is going to propel you to the next place. We're only 8 weeks in a lot of ways. We all recognize that this is going to take some time to move through. And I just see so much possibility across you as a group. So with that, I think what I want to do is move over to the Q&A and kind of open the space to hear from you in terms of questions or reactions that you had to what we shared today.
Yeah, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if it's more comfortable, you can just throw it right in the chat.
I think one of the things I'll just share is that, so there's a few of you on the phone that have also been participating. We're also hosting weekly kind of nonprofit executive director space on Wednesdays that we'll continue to do really through June.
Thanks, Ann.
And so one of the things I think has been amazing is to hear from leaders in the moment as they are really trying to work through this, to really work with their teams to get comfortable with the concept of new ideas, get comfortable with failing, and not just sort of say that's not possible or we don't do it that way. And so I think what we have to recognize with new ideas is that there's this entire thread. It's not only idea generation, it's the change management that goes along with implementation, and the fear of failure, and the fear of what will happen if we try something and it doesn't work. And so I think that the leaders we've been talking to week have been really intentional about being observant of that and then sitting with it and saying, how do I work around that? How do I bring people along? And I think one of the things that's been amazing is the acknowledgement that sometimes the resistance is about fear and it's about loss. And so as much as our session today has been about the new ideas and the disruption, I think a lot of us are still, and leaders are still working with staff who are still really experiencing pretty substantive grief. So it's really hard to get them to the next place. And so I guess I just wanted to make sure that each of you can kind of sit with that and just know that that's part of this work, is to how do you actually move people through the loss due to the crisis, in order to kind of get them to be able to participate in this envisioning the next future. And I think that's probably the hardest part of your jobs right now from where I sit.
Hey, Ann.
Yeah, Ann, jump in.
Thank you. I've been thinking about some of the things that you were suggesting that we engage our teams in conversation and talking about, and reflecting on the tension between, I have a very small team, as you know, And we're spinning plates on all of our not just appendages but digits, and it feels like we don't have time to slow down and have the conversations that you're suggesting.
Mhm.
As important as they are, sometimes it's hard to carve out that time and set up a trust environment, right?
Right.
Where you've shifted from the day to day and you're in this new space and you're trying to explore these other things. And I was wondering if anybody has suggestions about how to accomplish that.
Yeah. So I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear from other leaders on the line who might want to jump in on Anne's question first before I maybe suggest something. But I'd love to hear, are others in some ways able to create some of that innovation space or intentional space to think about the future? And what strategies might you be using?
One of the things that I did was, it's my instinct to want to be really reaching out to all of my volunteers individually and really be in the thick of things. But I resisted that and really tried as much as I could to get my staff jumping in and helping with that as much as I can. And then, you know, if they have something important, they're great. They'll bring it right to me. We can talk things over. I'm staying in touch with them. But I really very consciously set aside time to figure out some of this stuff and make sure that I was prioritizing this piece of it, because I think that's really critical right now.
I think one of the things that I'm seeing is some people are doing, like, they're blocking time, like there's a day in the week or an afternoon in the week that becomes kind of precious or sacred for either just the CEO or the CEO and a couple of other voices to just create the space for this on a weekly basis if you can, even if you can only get 45 minutes or an hour. There's like a generative space that's really dedicated and set aside. And I think, Anne, it's about choosing, weaving in the information and the voices, you know, but sometimes given what you may be dealing with on a capacity perspective, you can only carve out, like, no, we're carving out Fridays at 3 o'clock because when we're going to think about the future, or it's Mondays because that's just a more energy focused day. You know, picking a day of a week that's sort of brighter and where the energy is in the week may be something to think a little bit about. And our team's talked a lot about also just the power of social. Like, I think we as a virtual team have been meeting twice a week. We have one meeting that's kind of structured and one of the meetings where we encourage people to bring their beverage of choice, which is where our idea for this webinar series came from. Because that's where the idea connections actually kind of happen, is not when we're talking about work, but actually when we're talking about a whole bunch of other things. Lisa, did you want to jump in too?
She has what Lisa posted in the chat, a concern about if you try and be inclusive and include customers in a team, you run the risk of rumors or people being upset of what's going to happen, and maybe not having, paraphrase, a trusted environment where everybody else can be open.
Lisa, I think it's a great question. You know, I think in some ways part of this is, can you ensure that those customer voices are heard in some way? If you really are concerned that some of the discussions will not be safe, or that in some ways people will kind of take one meeting and like run with it and take it public. And that's where that sort of like protecting the new and innovation kind of comes in a little bit, is that the new ideas are new. They're not decided. They're pieces and parts of what's possible. And you've got to be able to say to people, what we talk about in these meetings, we may not be able to execute, but we've got to kind of create the space to generate the ideas. So I think in some ways it's really being thoughtful of making sure that the voice of the customer is present. If your organization feels that that's a very risky way to kind of engage, maybe it's just a focus group with some of those customers for them to weigh in on some of these questions. It's not a deciding thing, it's a focus group, which means you're gathering their opinions. You're not deciding anything. So you may need to think about a couple of different strategies to kind of raise up those voices in a way that feels safe for your organization. Focus groups are great ways to do that.
And I would say too, on the flip side of that, that there's a risk for some customers too, right? Some vulnerable customers to to idea float to them something that could be really impactful is also not safe for them, because it does sort of get the hopes up, right? So that the dialogue with that stakeholder group would probably need to be much different.
Thank you for that, Sarah. So we're just up on 4:31. I'm going to wrap up the formal portion of our session today and just make a couple of reminders as we close out. Next up is next Tuesday. We will, as I said, lean into the board and CEO relationship. But we are at the point in the webinar where we cut over to open discussion for those who would like to stay with us. We really do hope that today has been helpful to all of you. And we really do hope that we will see you again next week. Lisa, nice to see you. She says she's got to run to a meeting. But thank you so much to all of you for joining us. And we'll hang out for the open discussion. And just as a reminder, we always turn the recording off at this point in time.